Hello, this is Berkshire Family History Presents. I'm Angela Rifkin. I'm the Vice President of BFHA, and today I'm going to be talking to you about using one of the best research tools available at no cost, free and online, for researching your ancestors. And that resource is the United States Federal Census. I'm going to give you the address now, and I'll probably repeat it later. www.usfederalcensus.gov. I'll repeat that, www.usfederalcensus.gov. Now, what is in the census? Many of you have had experience filling one out in the past, but we're going to go back and look at some of the earlier ones and find out why they offer the information and the pathways to further exploration. Now, the purpose of the census was determined by Congress in the late 1700s because we were a brand new country and they wanted to know how many people were here. So what they did was a census, sending out or using people to knock on doors and finding out who are you, where do you live, and who's in the household. So for instance, an enumerator might go to someone living in Pittsfield, find out where they're living and who they're living in Pittsfield, and find out who's living in the household. Now, unfortunately for us, the very early censuses offered very little information. It gives the head of household, the name, and other people within the household, but only listed by gender and groups of ages. So for our purposes, not very helpful unless you have somebody who lived in the Pittsfield or Berkshire area in the early ages, early part of our country. So anyhow, we're going to keep moving on because as we're going to find out, there's a great deal of information available. Okay, so the first census was, as I just explained. Now let me tell you what's not on the census. Something called vital records. Vital records are birth, marriage, and death records. Those records are at the county courthouse where the event took place. If you were born in Pittsfield, your birth record will be at the Pittsfield County Clerk's office. If you died in, let's say, Bennington County in Vermont, your death record will be at the county clerk or county courthouse in Bennington. So the records are available and anybody can go in and get it, but it will not be on the census. But there are other ways to find out that information which tend to emerge the longer we look through the censuses, and I'll point those out to you. So another point of the census was when the census is completed, the information is given to the government and used by the government immediately. And they need to know how many people are here and what services are needed. The government at that point determined that some people might not want their personal information, just their names and location, available to the public. So when they legislated the census, they determined that availability for the public would not be there for them until 72 years after the census. That seems odd, doesn't it? Well, the reason they did that was they figured out, well, I don't know how they did, but they determined that most people's lifespan was approximately 70 or mid-70s. And at 72 years, if you're no longer living, then any information about you could be available for the public. So we're going to see that as we go along. So let's keep going. The first census was in 1790, which I just explained, and the subsequent ones will not give you that much more. The 1800s, not too many. 1910, not too much. 1830, again. Incidentally, although white Americans were counted in the census, slaves were not counted, and Native Americans were not counted. As we move along now into the 1830s, we look at other questions that were asked But again, we're not seeing names, and for us as researchers, that's what we want. Okay, now we go to 1840. Another question that was asked in 1840, did anybody fight in the American Revolutionary War? If so, that person may have applied for a pension. Those pension records, if he applied, are available, again, online. So if you go back that far and you knew of a relative, or you have a relative or an ancestor who fought in the American Revolution, you can look up pension records from that time. By the way, those records are also available at the Pittsfield Athenaeum Local History Department, and they're available on microfilm. So it's another source for you if you go back, or your family goes back that far. Now we get to 1850, and now we start getting the information that we want. Now they give the names of everyone in the household and their ages at that time. Now, that's helpful to us, even though they don't give us the date of birth, but we can calculate the date of birth by looking at the ages when the census was enumerated. For instance, if you're 30 years old in 1830, obviously you were born in 1800. So you can go down the list of family members and figure out when they were born. Also, they wanted to know anybody over the age of 15 if they were working. Remember, they started working very early in those days. Their question was if they could read or write. So we're learning a little bit about what education was available at that time. There's a rather odd question that was given in that census, and we all giggle a little bit about it. And I'll read the question to you. It asks, if one is a fugitive from the state. Well, who would answer that if you were a fugitive? Seems odd. I'm not sure what that was in response to, but we just let it go and we keep moving on. There were separate slave schedules that started to be developed, and slavery, as you well know, was part of our history. And the slave schedules begin to tell people how many, not only how many slaves, but they give gender and names of the households where the slaves were living. The 1960 census counted a number of people. We were up to 31 million at that point. And they asked a number of other questions. We're interested really in locating our ancestors and filling in the blanks of our own knowledge. Now, we also asked in that census, was anyone in the household married during that year? There could be an adult child that was married in that year. Right away, if so, we have information about that person. A marriage occurred that year, and even if we have not been able to get to the county clerk's office, we now have information about that particular person in the household. Now, the next census is a little bit sad, but it's what it is. In 1870, the Civil War, the American Civil War, ended in 1865. The 1870 census is going to reflect many changes in where people lived and members of the household. We start to see emerging heads of households by widowed females, and the answer is self-explanatory there. We also see changes in location. We see people living in different places than they were prior to the Civil War. We also see combined families, people living together because of changes that occurred. You might want to notice that in 1860, if there was a male 10-year-old living in a household, by 1870, that 10-year-old was now 20. Does that 10-year-old continue to show up in the household or not? If not, we can think that maybe that child was now a soldier, maybe living or not living elsewhere. So as I said, it was a rather sad time. Also, that 1870 census, many southern states were not counted. Why? Resentment, anger, unwillingness to participate in going through the southern states. So that's unfortunate as well. But that was what happened in those days. War was very dislocating, as we all know. Okay, in 1880, there isn't too many changes. We're starting to look at a question that could be vital. The question gets asked, where was your mother or father born? So if I'm the head of household, male or female, I now answer the question, my parents were either born here or possibly born in another country. Now here's an added piece of information for us, because now we know that there's immigration that occurred somewhere along the line, whether it be from the head of household or maybe the parents came here. We don't know that yet, but we notice that the parents did come here from someplace other than this country. Also, there was a spot to indicate, and if men 21 years of age, if by any chance they were denied the right to vote. I'm not sure how that was handled when the census came in, but it was interesting that they added that, because we do know that could have happened, especially post-Civil War. We also had a terrible event after that. In 1890, the records were stored in a facility, I believe, in the Midwest. And the facility had a fire, and practically no records from the 1890 census exist. The fire did damage, but most of the fire was from the water that was used to put out the fire, which is tough because that's the beginning of the age of the era and ages of immigration. So we know that we lost a lot of information about people coming here at that time, but we're often able to piece together from other sources information from those years. Not easy, but it is available. There are various collections that both Ancestry and National Archives have done research in to collate and collect information from other sources for those years. The 1900 census gives a beginning of great number of information. It gives the number of dwelling houses and family members in the way the census taker took them. So if you were living on Wendell Avenue, the family would know that it was a certain address on Wendell Avenue. If your ancestor goes back to that section of Wendell Avenue, it might be interesting to know where they lived. We want to know how many children were in the household. We also wanted to ask how many were foreign-born. Remember, I just spoke about the era of immigration. So we start to see that. We also want to know how long they were living in the United States if they immigrated, and what is the citizen status of the people. Now, when I talk about that, and I'm going to talk about that in the 1920 census, that determines whether people became American citizens or not. They were not required to, but many people did. That means that they applied for naturalization. And when we get to the 1920 census, we're going to see the benefits of having that paperwork available for us to look at in terms of knowledge about our ancestors. So the 1910 census also had a lot of information. But before I get into that, I want to tell you what happened to the 1910 census. The government, in preparing for it, decided to buy ink, which was used by the enumerators to write the census form, decided to go for, how shall I say, a less expensive type of ink. The unfortunate part is that as the years progressed, that ink has faded away. Well, we do the best we can. Some censuses from 1910 are very clear, and you can read them well. But if you go through it online especially, you will notice that as some states or some areas, the census information has declined precipitously because the ink has faded. But not all is lost, because the best that happened was in 1920. What about 1920? Well, there's lots of good stuff that was done in 1920. We have the original immigrants who came here. We have information about them. And we have extensive ways to track our ancestors through various sources. Now, before I go on, I just wanted to show you what a census looks like, and I'm going to try holding it up here, and maybe we could zoom in on it. Okay. This is the 1920 census. Now, you'll notice it's a very crowded sheet of paper. And you'll also notice that it's all handwritten. Some of the columns are very skinny, very narrow. I know there have been times I've had to use a magnifying glass, but if you're using it online, you can certainly zoom it up. But this is what the 1920 census looked like. So there was no ink fading in those years, thank goodness, because it is a gold mine of information. Well, what's in the 1920 census? The questions asked to the head of household was, were your mother and father born here, or were your mother and father born someplace else? And if your mother and father were born someplace else, where? Now, that's a great, wonderful piece of information, because we often have people looking for where their ancestors came from prior to coming to this country if they were immigrants. And often there is little knowledge available. So this gives us a valuable clue, so that if the head of household or any member of the household was asked where your mother and father came from, and let's say they said Ireland or Italy or Austria, we now can say, wait a minute, we have an opportunity to explore that, because passenger and immigration lists are also available online. So that's another good piece of information that we get from that 1920 census. Now, expanding on that, if you became naturalized, you had formworks and paperworks to fill out. And they asked the question in the 1920 census, were you naturalized? If the answer is yes, the question then is, when? What year did you get naturalized? Now, I don't know if anybody's ever looked at naturalization papers. They are a marvelous source of information. If you have an ancestor who was naturalized, and you can see that record online, it is available again, it asks not only the pertinent questions, name, date of birth, marriage, spouse's date of birth, the usual information. It says the country you came from, but more importantly, it gives the town or village of the country you emigrated from. Again, vital information, because many of us may get the information that says an ancestor came from Austria or Ireland or Italy, but we don't know where. But if they were naturalized, it really pinpoints that information for us. And we can find it online because naturalization papers are available. And that's a really great clue, because in my experience with people looking for their history, they don't know where in that foreign city or foreign country to look. So take a look at that 1920. If you have an ancestor who was naturalized, use that as the next step to find out where in whatever country they came from, the town they lived in. So you can see how the census begins to expand our knowledge. It gives us names, it gives us ages. It gives us the year of birth because we can calculate that. It gives us all the people in the household. Did the household change, move on? Did it move in different directions? Did it grow? Do we see deaths occurring in households as you follow them through every 10 years? If your family came from another country, it gives information about when they got here, or if they did not come here, where their family came from. So it gives that marvelous bits of pieces that many of us struggle to find, and it is available through the Federal Census. Again, free, online, good time, winter, sit in the computer and play a little bit. So it's a good, valuable source of information, and we always say, if you're starting your ancestor search, or even if you're somewhere along the way, check out that US Census, because as I just explained to you, there is so much there. Let's go on a little bit. After 1920, we have 1930. 1930 is also a complicated census year because it was the beginning of the United States Depression, which occurred from 1929 up to almost the very late 30s, very early 40s. We're going to see also changes because of people needing to find work during the Depression. There was a lot of moving about. So people that may have been living in Pittsfield or any place in Berkshire County, we may find that parts of the family have now moved to other places because they're no longer in the original family structure. Employment was difficult, and people needed to go where to find it. A strange question, or maybe it's not so strange, was asked in the 1930 census. I said earlier, there are some odd questions every so often in the years. The question was asked, do you have a radio? Think about that. In 1930, no television really, or no other access for information. So we think that the question was asked in order to find out if people had access to not only local information, but general information about what was going on in the world around them, especially in rural areas where information was so limited because they just had no access to ways of finding out. So the question was asked, do you have a radio? Seems a strange question in this day and age. The 1940 census is still online. All of them are online. And we can look at the 1940 because it is the end of the Depression, and people are starting to migrate towards cities. Why cities? Because we're becoming more and more industrialized, and much of the employment was occurring in cities. So if you have someone who was living in a rural area in Berkshire County, you may find that they're moving to, let's say, Pittsfield, because there's so much industry that had occurred in Pittsfield in those early days. So you're seeing moving of people around the county or around the entire United States. Now, the last census that is available, and I'll tell you what that is about, is the 1950 census. That is the last census available because if we use that 72-year frame that we've used before, that census became available in 2022. There it is, 72 years. Now, in 1950 is a very real possibility that some of you listening and watching this may be on that census, or your parents were on that census. So take a look. You never know what you'll find. I encourage you to use the census as a tool, and that's the key word, because as you've already noticed, that it gives you the basic information about our ancestors, but it also leads you down pathways, such as military pensions. Remember the Revolutionary War? Pension records. It also leads us down immigration records. People coming to this country, when did they get here? Those records are available online through passenger lists and other types of immigration. Also, the ways of becoming a citizen was the naturalization. If we have access to that, and it is available online, we now learn how to get that information about where this person lived in another country or came from in another country. So you see how much is available and how many ways it can lead you to other places. The US Census, as I said, is available, and your best possible use of it is to work at home. But if by any chance you have difficulty with it, you can come into the Pittsfield Athenaeum Local History Room and use one of the computers there, which will help you move through the censuses and tell you how to work through the computer to look at that. So again, I encourage you to do that. It's worthwhile. If you're on this journey, and most of us are, if we're looking at this channel right now, we are looking at learning more about our ancestors, their lives, what it was like, what they did, what kind of work they did. Were they affected by events? Yes. Were they affected by changes in their own population? So take a look, we learn, we listen, and pay attention to what you learn and copy everything down. I always encourage you to do that. So, encouraging to look at your census and be good to yourself. And wait till next time. Hope to see you then.